went with a colleague to Baghdad. So the government had been overthrown and a new parliamentary system had been created. And the new members of parliament were actually asking for help so they could better deal with each other. At one point, very suddenly, the wife stood up, put her arm on the table, and threw all of the materials on the table against the wall and just said, "I can't take it anymore." You know, Umar, I did a conference once where I had a breakout room. The topic was what lawyer mediators need to unlearn.
Unlearn. Yes, actually,
It
is
was
lawyers.
packed. It was packed.
Yes.
Everybody. That to me is the fundamental question. How will you get invited into the room in the first place? And for many people, they're really excited to mediate. They've maybe done a training and they've done role plays and they love doing it. The question is, after that, who's going to invite that newly trained mediator to come and mediate an actual dispute?
So, hi, one and all, and welcome back to the second episode of the SMC podcast. Today, I have a very, very special guest with me, Mr. David Seibel. David Seibel, that is the correct pronunciation, I believe. Mr. Seibel is the co-founder of the for-profit Insight Partners and non-profit Insight Collaborative. It's a conflict management firm with a primary office in the US Boston area, but operating globally. I met Mr. David Seibel in his role teaching mediation and conflict management through the program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School. And so that makes him my guru as well. Mr. David Seibel's work includes mediation, training, coaching, facilitating, and advising everyone from high-performing teams in global companies to parents trying to talk to their children. So that's a wide range that we have there. He is also an expert in influence, negotiation, relationship management, leadership, and handling conversations of all kinds. And I'm sure as we stride along in this podcast, there would be many, many interesting incidences that would be coming up. To start with, we just want to know your story, Mr. David Seibel. How did the mediation start? What was the trigger? And what is the exciting thing about mediation that made you make a career in it? If you can please share some thoughts.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Umar. It's a pleasure to see you again. To answer your question, I don't think there was a specific triggering event for me. It was more that I've always liked people, words, and problem solving. And I love helping people understand themselves and each other better. And for me, mediation was a perfect fit. Mediation training was something that was offered in law school, and I attended that my first semester and immediately fell in love with the act of mediating and also got really interested in teaching others to mediate very early.
So thank you for that. Since you have such a vast experience in mediation, if you can just recollect some of your memorable moments while mediating and as an expert mediator and trainer. I'm sure there are many successful mediations, while there may be few mediations from where we could pick up some takeaways that you would like to share. And I also noticed at one point of time, there was written somewhere in your bio that you have also been to Iraq for the purpose of training in conflict management. So I'm really all ears, and I think it would be an eye-opener for the audience as well, if you can share that.
Happy to. So that experience was in, I think, 2006. And I went with a colleague to Baghdad. So the government had been overthrown and a new parliamentary system had been created. And the new members of parliament were actually asking for help so they could better deal with each other. So as you said, under the label of really negotiation trainers and
Okay.
facilitators. We met separately with various stakeholder groups,
Okay.
and we did what really looked a lot like a private mediation session or a private mediation caucus with each of
Okay.
these stakeholder groups.
Okay.
And what we did in those meetings was help them focus on their own interests, right?
Okay.
Articulate their own interests more concisely,
Right.
and then also spend a fair bit of time getting them to try to create a list of other stakeholders' interests, just
Right.
like we would do in a mediation private session. And then we had them still just privately within their group try to generate options they thought the other groups could say yes to, which is
Okay.
also something we might do in a mediation. And
Okay.
then we brought them all together in essentially a joint session where we had them look at the list of interests they had made for each other
Okay.
and discuss like how accurate were those lists? What were
Mhm.
people missing? And then they broke into small groups, mixing the stakeholder groups to try to generate options based on those lists of interests. It was really fascinating and gratifying. And they came up with some options that they've implemented, even to today, ways of communicating with each other, especially.
True.
So it was very inspiring.
So, was there any cultural difference that you felt because you went from the US and it was a
Mm.
different culture, and when you were training them, their responses to the kind of typical training that we have in mediation?
Yes. I also I'm also American, and at that time in particular, the last thing I think many of them wanted was an American giving them advice in some ways because of America's intervention in
Yes.
their political system. And so there was that, which required a lot of humility and
Mhm.
curiosity on my part. And they were very gracious and very curious.
So good to know.
The the cultural differences for that experience were large. The things we focused on were, I think, fundamental to being human. So I spent a lot of time trying to find the commonalities and
Right.
generate practice advice that
Mhm.
will work across culture. So the words we choose or the way we develop rapport with each other
Yes.
varies greatly from culture to culture in terms of norms or expected behaviors. So you
True.
have to adjust the underlying parts, people's underlying interests, generating options to meet those interests,
Yes.
dealing with strong emotions. The way we do those, there are fundamental mindsets and
True.
behaviors that work across culture.
True.
So it wasn't easy to do
Mm-hmm.
that, especially in translation. They did not all speak English.
Okay.
I do not speak Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So it was in translation.
Okay.
So
So
we had
someone else was communicating this to them. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and so we had a mix of simultaneous interpretation.
Okay.
So while I'm talking, someone else is listening right next to me and speaking at the same time just after me. And then
Mm-hmm.
we also had sequential interpretation on other days where it wasn't that as fluid, as smooth. I had to pause.
Mm-hmm.
They then listened to the interpreter and then back to me. And so that was also the first time I'd experienced that. And it does have an impact on the quality of communication. It was
Right.
another layer of challenge.
But I'm sure the core ideas went in their heads and it really worked for them. Because if we are able to give them this chance of creating options in mutual interest, I think there can't be anything better in as conflict ridden zone as Iraq. So thank you for sharing that experience. I was also reading that apart from different kinds of mediations that you do, you have also done family mediation for a great amount of time. So, would you
Mm.
be comfortable in sharing some instances, some particular instances which you can recollect?
Sure. Yeah, I did when I started mediating, I did a lot of volunteering in local court systems in the Boston area in the US where
Mhm.
the courts had arrangements with different mediation programs to have mediators there
Okay.
for small disputes. And then I spent almost a year just doing family related
Okay.
cases.
Okay.
And so there was divorce, a lot of issues around co-parenting of
Mhm.
children,
True.
and similar issues. So I would say one of my most memorable family experiences
Right.
uh, did not go very well. And so I'll just share that one briefly. There was a husband and a wife. They wanted to try mediation,
Okay.
in part because they thought it might be keep things more in their control instead
Mm-hmm.
of a judge or a third person making decisions. But they had a very hard time being at the table together.
Okay.
I, I was co-mediating as a way of learning
Okay.
and teaching. And my co-mediator and I, after the first session, we thought that we had done a really good job because they were able to talk and we made some progress. And then there was a second session. And in
Okay.
the second session, they started talking in very practical details about the children.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, at one point, very suddenly, the wife stood up, put her arm on the table, and threw all of the materials on the table against the wall and just said, I can't take it anymore. And
Okay.
then stood there. She didn't walk away. She
Mm-hmm.
just stood there. The remaining three of us, so two mediators and the husband, just froze.
Mm-hmm.
The moment felt to me like it lasted 10 minutes of just frozen silence. I'm guessing it was more like 10 seconds. And the co-mediator had the instinct to stand up slowly
Mm-hmm.
and meet the wife's eyes
Mm-hmm.
and stayed there and just said, it's clear you're really upset.
Okay. Affect labeling. Yeah.
Ugh. Like I was still frozen. Um, and that move was enough to bring the wife to say much more calmly, of course I am. And that led to a conversation about what in the past 5 minutes had happened
Hmm.
that had triggered such a strong reaction. And it was a very productive conversation after that. But I considered that as a failure on my part, because I really didn't have a plan. I didn't know what to do. And I was so thrown by the sudden strong emotions that got
Right.
me really interested in how to manage our own strong reactions as
True.
mediators.
As mediators, how do we keep
Yeah,
ourselves as neutrals? Yes.
because I was triggered. I was triggered. And so that led me down a path of really focusing on not only how do we manage other people's strong emotions, which my colleague did very well, but my colleague had also managed their own strong reaction well enough to make a move, to do something that turned out to be very helpful.
True, true. This is something so important in mediation, that how do we maintain the control of the process and how do we keep the control on our own emotions? Because if someone is behaving offensively almost like that, so that's a great lesson. I mean, although, like you say, that it did not succeed, but it's a great lesson for all of us as the listeners, that what posture or what demeanor should the mediator maintain when these kind of situations do come up.
Mm,
Has there been any safety issue at any given point of time during the time of mediation? Because in India, we had, there was this video going on where parties started fighting with each other physically, and
mm,
it was a question of the safety of the mediator as well. So
mm.
something like that, if you have where the parties have got
I
violent.
That story I just told you is the closest that I've experienced that where somebody became very physical.
Mm-hmm.
in the moment. Interestingly, that concept of safety
Mm-hmm.
in mediation, which of course
Mm-hmm.
applies to the mediator, as you said, as
True.
well as the parties. The thing that I've had to worry about many times was what was going to happen after our meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Once they leave, these two people who have had a lot of experience fighting with each
Right.
other, maybe not a lot of experience talking about what they talked about with us, it can actually trigger very strong feelings.
True.
And what if one person doesn't like what the other one said at the meeting? When they go out into the parking lot,
Mm-hmm.
what's happening there? So I've had some situations where we've asked one of the parties to
Okay.
stay for an additional conversation
Right.
while we
Party
said to
leaves.
the other one,
Mm-hmm.
that's all for today and you're welcome
Mm-hmm.
to go, trying
Right.
to create a buffer, a space
Right.
where we could privately talk to that person and ask if
Mm-hmm.
they felt comfortable or not, and whether there was any concern around physical issues. I had a case that was very difficult where there were accusations
Mm-hmm.
of abuse
Okay.
privately. In a
Mm-hmm.
private conversation,
Conversation.
one of the parties talked about their spouse
Mm-hmm.
um, ab abusing or potentially abusing children, or maybe even the wife. Very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
That's a situation where I was very grateful that I had a co-mediator, which is more of a teaching model.
Yes.
And it also, though, is a very powerful thing as a mediator to have someone to
True.
talk through how to handle
True.
situations like that.
Yes, these emotions are, really hard to tackle, especially in family mediations. Things are, we are dealing with some very charged emotions. I've faced a couple of them, so I can
Mm.
tell that, this is a very difficult and tricky area. So you have also been into teaching mediation. Apart from being the mediator yourself and such an accomplished mediator, you have also taught people from diverse backgrounds, and the Harvard Law batch that we had, there were people from psychology background. There were people from, I think, many people were there from non-legal background also. So how did you come to the mediation teaching as such, and what has been your experience thus far? And why do you think that mediation is not just limited to the lawyers, but it is also reaching out to many other sectors as well?
Well, maybe I'll start with the last part of that.
Yeah.
Uh, I I think people come to mediate for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some of those are overlapping for people.
Mm-hmm.
Like me, I think a lot of mediators want to be helpful. So
Mm.
it's a way to help people. I think for others, there's fun in the problem solving, finding solutions or helping other people find solutions. I think for others, it's just practical. They're trying to expand what they do. For example, a lot of lawyers or mental health professionals
True.
see mediation as an additional offering,
Mm.
where they might be able to generate revenue while serving people. And so I think the act of mediating, I mean,
Mm.
in many places in the world, there are no rules. There isn't certification. You can just help other people negotiate.
Right. Right.
Sort of facilitate negotiation is one
True.
definition of mediation. And so as a result, anyone can do it.
Yes.
I think
It's a life skill
lawyers,
at the moment. Yes.
yeah, lawyers have sometimes tried to control the space. Sometimes I think that's about business. Sometimes I think it's because they worry about informed consent. Can
Mm.
a non-lawyer really help people make an informed decision if the mediator doesn't know anything about alternatives like litigation?
Right.
What would happen in court? What
Mm.
if the parties have very unrealistic ideas of what might happen in a court, if they can't resolve their dispute,
True.
can the mediator judge whether or not, or I mean, assess whether or not there's informed consent? So I think there's a valid topic there.
True.
Uh, and I don't know that it always needs to be the mediator's responsibility to
Hmm.
know about all those alternatives. For example, I've mediated with non-lawyers, co-mediated family cases
Okay.
where the non-lawyer knew much more about the local law than I
Okay.
did.
Okay.
I really was there as a process expert,
Yes.
and I was the lawyer, and the
Right.
non-lawyer mediator was really there to make sure that there was informed consent,
Mm.
and information sharing about how the legal process worked. It just
Mm.
turned out that she had more knowledge than I did, uh, and
Right.
and so in that sense, I don't think it really matters whether somebody is a lawyer or not. They just have to think about things in different ways
Right.
and maybe get different types of training to be
Right.
effective. You know, Umar, I did a conference once where I had a breakout room. The topic was what lawyer mediators need to unlearn.
Unlearn. Yes. Actually, it
It
is
was
lawyers.
packed. It was packed.
Yes.
Everybody, it was an elective question. The room was full of lawyers
Right.
and some non-lawyers who were curious.
Right.
But there's some of the way that lawyers are often trained. For example,
Adversarial process.
lawyers Yeah, I mean, you could probably guess the kinds of things that lawyers might need to unlearn just from your own experience. But one of them is lawyers often think they have to have the answer or the solution for everything. Like
Right.
that's what people are paying them for. It
True.
just depends on your training. Not all lawyers are trained that way.
True.
Knowing where to get answers is critical. Acting like you have all the answers, maybe not. And it's the
Yes.
same in mediation.
So the next thing is that you have been training so many people. So many people have got into the profession of mediation. What is the status of mediation as a practice in the US right now? Is it evolved as a proper established practice? And how are the things in the US? If you can just throw some light.
It varies. It varies depending on where in the US.
Mhm.
It's not that there is one centralized or federal set of rules that govern mediation, and so it can vary by state.
Okay.
It can even vary by court system
Hmm.
or even court to court.
Hmm.
The extent to which the courts refer cases to mediation or welcome mediators into the building, it can really vary.
Hmm.
And the people's knowledge of mediation as an option
Hmm.
varies, even though it's been since probably the 1970s where people were really holding themselves out as mediators, with
Right.
mediation being an option. So it varies. There's a very established practice in some areas, like in family law.
Okay.
You'll see mediators as more of a norm.
Okay.
There are certain types of commercial disputes
Hmm.
where it's very common. For example, in the insurance industry, there's so many cases that it's a way to try to reduce the court caseload.
Right.
And in some court systems, they have their own mediation programs where they
Hmm.
have mediators that judges can refer people to mediators who work
Mm.
full time
Court
in
administration.
the courts.
Mm.
And so, but that varies across North America and including the US. That said, if you mention mediation to most lawyers, they know what it is.
Right.
And depending on what kind of practice they have,
Hmm.
they may well have been in a mediation representing a party, and probably all judges know what mediation is.
Right.
That doesn't mean they know the kind of nuances that you were just talking about, the sort of what lawyers need to unlearn.
Right.
A lot of judges and lawyers become mediators and they don't unlearn anything. They treat mediation a little bit like a mini courtroom,
Right. Right. Right.
sometimes.
Hmm.
So I don't know. That was a very long answer to a very concise question. What
No,
is
no,
the
but it
state of
it needed that
mediation in the
detailing.
US?
Hmm.
I think
So
it's more developed than in some other parts of the world. but it's
True.
still not something that every person who's in a dispute realizes is an
Mhm.
option. It's not that everyone assumes you've considered mediation.
Okay.
Mediators are still selling mediation. They're
Right.
still trying to make the pitch.
Now, many people are actually going towards mediation, especially in the global south, where we have courts being overwhelmed by the litigation. So, we have around more than 5 crore cases pending in Indian courts right now. And there is a lot of demand of mediation in this part of the world. So, when we choose as youth who have done law or any other stream for that matter, when they choose to become mediators, how do they make it monetarily and morally satisfying for themselves? Of course, I mean, morally, it looks like a noble pursuit that, we are going to resolve the disputes between two parties, their relationships will be maintained, etc., all the benefits that we know about. But how do we develop it as a, monetarily sustainable practice, considering early starters?
It's hard.
Hmm.
It definitely varies depending on where you're practicing. And so I'm sure even within India, depends on where you are.
Yes,
And
that's true.
the challenge for making money as a mediator is
Hmm.
access. It's access. That to me is the fundamental question. How will you get invited into the room in the first place? And for many people, they're really excited to mediate. They've maybe done a training and they've done role plays and they love doing it. The question is, after that, who's going to invite that newly trained mediator to come and mediate an actual dispute? Is there a job available where someone else finds the cases and then assigns you to them? That's fantastic. Where you live, is that happening? Are there ways to get jobs where someone else is giving you access, is finding the cases?
Hmm.
For many people, they need to start by volunteering
Hmm.
their time for free in order to get experience
Right.
and to help create a network where people get to know
True.
them and are willing to make referrals. One reason a lot of mental health professionals and a lot of lawyers can become mediators is because they have a network where
Hmm.
there are people who have situations that
Yes.
are a good match
Yes.
for mediation, and they have a network of
Hmm.
professional contacts who will refer them cases if they say that they're mediating. And so it's one of those things where many of the people I know who mediate
Hmm.
make a living by doing multiple things, not
Okay.
just mediating,
Right.
because access is difficult. So, for example, you and I, we teach in
Yes.
addition to mediate, right? That's another way to make money while
True.
still being in the practice.
Right.
And so most of my colleagues have multiple activities. In
Right.
my case, even things like being a trainer of negotiation or
Hmm.
teaching leadership or advising a senior executive,
Even corporate
coaching
trainings.
in
Yeah.
individuals, all of those behaviors, all of those activities, I trace all of it back to the
Hmm.
foundation of what I learned in basic mediation training. It's the
Right.
concepts and skills of mediation training
Hmm.
that can create a platform for a very big conflict management practice.
Right.
I'm just not sure that all mediators are aware of that,
Yes.
of the
Yes.
different ways that you can
We can
apply those
diversify there.
skills.
Yes, 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 yes. So I think that's very well put because there is this dilemma that what can we do? But then I have a similar kind of answer what you say that we unless and until at this stage we are diversifying ourselves in terms of revenue, we can't only depend on mediation. But a very fundamental question, Mr. Seibel, that why is it like that? Why are people still more inclined and more trusting towards the adjudication formal processes? And mediators are not really in that much of demand. Would you have some idea of that? Because I'm not able to make a sense of it.
Uh, I mean, I think the typical response
Mhm.
tends to be around education, that the people
Awareness.
who
Yeah.
have the disputes just
Right.
aren't as aware as we are
Right.
of what mediation can do for them.
Hmm.
So I think that has to be part of the answer. I think that people who have disputes that would be great for mediation, or where mediation would be really helpful to the parties,
Right.
th- there also can be conflicts of interest. I
Hmm.
mean, if I'm a lawyer and I have a case, it might not even be conscious on my part. I'm just
Hmm.
thinking, oh, I really want to litigate. Like, I can really help this person by litigating. So I'm
Right.
not even thinking about other
Party's interest.
processes
Yes.
that I, in my mind, I'm still thinking about the party. I'm serving the party's interest best by me litigating this,
Hmm.
but I'm not stopping to really think through, is there a process better suited to this?
True.
One of my mentors was Frank Sander, a professor at Harvard Law School, who he created the idea of what he called the multi-door courthouse,
Okay.
which exists in the United States in some places, where a disputant comes in the front door, but then there's a screener
Right.
who is very aware of different dispute resolution processes.
Okay.
And they educate the person with the dispute and also make a suggestion that you might want to try this method of dispute resolution, as opposed to the reason they walked through the door, which was to litigate.
Right.
It's a really interesting idea. And his idea was to have every courthouse in the United States have that quick interview at the door
Hmm.
to make sure that people realize that there are multiple options. And if that person who's screening is educated, they can advise those people on
Hmm.
why a certain process like mediation might be worth trying before they go down the litigation path. Uh,
That's amazing
um,
because I think it is close to including mediation advocacy within the system itself, and
Interesting.
it can really work wonders. Well, it has been a wonderful experience. I don't know how I was as a host to you. I tried my best. I was a bit nervous in the beginning, but the way you have brought out different aspects of mediation, the nuances, your experiences, I'm sure that all of us would be getting a lot of insights from that. So thank you for all of your education that you gave to us. And it is almost a crash course for a lot of us, what we have just got in half an hour. Before we part, would there be any final words from your side as far as the mediation is concerned?
Uh, well, first I want to say thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't notice that you were nervous at all, and you're a very gracious host, and you
Thank
let
you.
me talk at length. I apologize if it was too much at times. You have so much wisdom to share yourself, that I feel like I should turn it around and now interview you. If you ever want to do that, I'm happy to be the interviewer and ask you about your experiences. I would say, uh, cultivate curiosity.
Right.
I feel like cultivating curiosity in ourselves as conflict management professionals, trying
Hmm.
to get disputants to be more curious about their own assumptions
Right.
about the other person. I feel like by continuing to cultivate curiosity in ourselves and in others,
Hmm.
we can make the world better.
Great. Thank you for those words. In fact, most of the people whom I have trained, and all thanks to you because I got the tools of training from you only, at the end, almost unanimously, they said that regardless of the fact whether we go into full time mediation or not, we certainly believe that we have evolved as human beings. And this is
Hmm.
something that all of them have shared unanimously. And I think that's what mediation does to you. It gives you that ability to really think from the other side. So,
I think that's also a reflection on the quality of the education you gave and the type of training that you did. There are these fundamental aspects of being human. We all have the same list of interests that drive us everywhere. We
true.
all have the same list of difficult tactics that we are likely to use to get what we want everywhere. And it turns out that being aware of those things can really just help navigate life.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you. In the Indian way, I would do it with folded hands. You have really given a lot of insights to us, Mr. Seibel.
Thank you so much.